Let me apologize in advance for the way my voice sounds. I'm on the back end of whatever it was that was going around Nashville. I'm better now, but it's congested and combined with my kind of funky southern drawl might be problematic for some of you. I'm going to talk about education in Black Nashville today. And in all honesty, I probably need 2-3 days to talk about this. But what I've done is I condensed as much as I can in an hour to leave sometimes for Q&A. So I'll do my best. Our discussion of education is important in the context of this whole series, because a lot of the things that we've talked about, some of the stuff that Dr. Sharfstein is going to talk about next week, they intersect in really, really powerful ways. We talked a little bit about religion the last time I stood before you, I think. We're talking about education today, and we'll be talking about civil rights next week. And oftentimes you're going to find that when we start looking at individuals, we're actually talking about the same people. So let's begin. One of the nicknames of Nashville is the Athens of the South. And I humbly submit to you that if we don't take in account so I thought that was mine. I asked a question in class a couple of weeks ago, and Siri says, "I don't know, Lee, what do you think?" So, anyway, if we don't take in account African American efforts to obtain an education in the history of the city, then we're making a mistake. We're fooling ourselves to even describe the city as the Athens of the South. Oftentimes when we think about Black education, we don't go back far enough. Most of the time when we think of Black education in Nashville, one of the things that comes to mind is Fisk and Meharry and Freedmen's Schools throughout that was established during the Reconstruction period. These northern mission associations and benevolent associations, they get a lot of credit. But recent scholarship has demonstrated that, and bear this in mind, recent scholarship demonstrates that much of their success was built upon efforts that had been taken by African Americans 30 years before. One of my dear friends, Crystal graduated from Vanderbilt, I think, in 2013. But here's what she wrote in her article. She says that the victories of Northern whites were won on the educational battleground that Black Nashville had begun to till decades before their arrival, and independent of Northern philanthropic and missionary support. So what Dr. DeGregory is saying, that they had a foundation. It wasn't like they came in and found barren land. There had been things that was going on. Indeed, what Dr. DeGregory shows in her work is that 30 years prior to the establishment of Fisk University, African Americans in this city sought to provide an education for their children, and the results were mixed. One of the names that I want you to be familiar with is not James Thomas yet, but a gentleman named Alphonso Sumner. Sumner was a free Black man living in Nashville, and he worked as a barber. And like many barbers during this period, whether they were enslaved or free, the most successful ones usually had an exclusively white clientele. And and I learned this really early on, there are a lot of lessons to be learned in barbershops. Barbershops are oftentimes the great equalizers in our society. Rich and poor, well-known, and just the run-of-the-mill guys off the street. They come in there and you have a free exchange of ideas. These are really important places. But here he is, he's a free black man living in Nashville, and I can imagine at least for a little while, he has some sense of power over his white clientele just by the simple fact that he has a straight razor but it's interesting in that he listens to what's going on, and in his mind he says, okay, we need to do something to educate our children in this city. So we're in the 1930s. He establishes his first school we're in the 1830s. He establishes his first school in 1833. And let's look at the backdrop of that, right? In 1831, Nat Turner leads a fierce rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, a rebellion that results in the death of 51 whites. And you can imagine the paranoia that exists in the South at this time, right? And we find it manifesting itself right here in the volunteer state. Tennessee State Assembly in 1831 passes a law that says that, hey, if you free your slaves, you got to send them from the state. You have to expel them from the state. So they can be free, but they can't be free here. Now imagine this, all of this going on, and here you are, you have a free black man who wants to establish a school. I can imagine the folks in Nashville being really curious about what was being taught, especially in the wake of Nat Turner's rebellion. Well, Sumner establishes a school for free black children in Nashville. He says it's for free black children, but somehow or another, enslaved black children managed to find their way into these schools. Y'all remember, this might have been the very first talk I had with you guys when we talked about Sally Thomas and her having 3 sons. Well, her baby boy was James P. Thomas. James Thomas was the son of Sally Thomas and a white judge named John Catron. The father was a judge, a white judge. The mother was a slave, but so her status made the baby a slave. Bear that in mind. But he gets an education from the school, and it suggests that education was something that was desired not only by freed black persons, but enslaved as well. And I think what is really peculiar about this is that some of the enslaved children that sat down in front of Sumner had the permission of their masters to get educated. Okay. In 1836, his school began with about 20 students, but it quickly grew to 200 students. And although he had retained a somewhat privileged position, if you will, in Nashville among whites, this did not insulate him from racism. In 1836, he was accused of writing letters to 2 fugitive slaves that were living in Detroit. These letters were intercepted, and it was used as evidence to suggest that he might have been complicit in their escape. He was taken out to a place called the Slicks here in Nashville. I still don't know where the Slicks are, so if any Nashville natives out there know of this place, Please enlighten me. But he was taken there and he was almost beaten to death, nearly whipped to death. So after he survived the whipping, he had enough of Nashville. He had enough of Davidson County. So he left and settled in Cincinnati, and he never came back. The school shut down for a while after his exile from the state. Nevertheless, the drive for an education did not end among Nashville's free black population. As a matter of fact, one of the teachers that he hired, a gentleman named Daniel Watkins, picked up the baton, if you will, and carried it a little bit further, so much so that Watkins is hailed by many to be the father of black education in Nashville. But he had some help from a black woman who has kind of gotten left in the shadows. Her name was Sarah Porter. Sarah Porter ran a boarding house in the city. The school doesn't reopen until 1838, but I want to suggest to you that that Porter and Watkins, in the meantime, were running clandestine schools, or these sort of shadow schools, if you will, where they teach children during the evenings, where they teach children out of the sight of whites who were opposed to this idea of black education. But still, they push. In 1838, free blacks in the city draft a petition calling for a school. But there was one caveat. They called for the creation of a school that would be taught by a white teacher. So in what was a curious situation, you have a free black man hiring a white man from Wilson County to teach black children. And the man that he hired his name was John Yandle of Wilson County. Yandle operated the school on the corner of what is now 9th Avenue North, and Joe Johnston. The school later moved to 6th Avenue North and Joe Johnston. Watkins had to keep moving the school to accommodate the increasing number of students he had, but also to allay white fears. Still, in 1855, a group of whites informed him that he must close his school immediately. They told him if blacks were to get an education, free blacks were to get an education, they would have to go to Indiana or Illinois or some other free territory. They could not get it here in Nashville. Then in 1856, the city council orders him to close his school. And this school would effectively remain closed until 1862. He's able to reopen it in 1862. What happens in 1862? Well, the Yankees show up over there in Edgefield, and the city falls back into Union hands. So now he's able to reopen his school. So in looking at this, what I want to do is just to reaffirm what my brilliant colleague has already argued, that when the American Missionary Association and the Freedmen's Bureau arrive here, the ground has been sown and it is very, very fertile. So in 1866, when there's a move to establish Fisk University, there's a move to establish Fisk, but during the process of it, during the couple of years before it being established, the Freedmen's Bureau has has built upon a foundation that was actually started by groups like the Pennsylvania Benevolent Association, who were opening up schools around the city while the war was still going on. But Fisk opens in 1866, and it did not open in North Nashville. The next time you guys are by Nashville Electric, you know how you're going up the back road heading up toward the Gulch. If you look really quickly on your right, you'll see a sign that says Fisk Avenue. There were some Army barracks there back during 1865, and this is where Fisk was originally located. But they needed a new site, so they purchased land in North Nashville, where, if you guys are familiar with where Jubilee Hall is today, there was a fort there called Fort Gillum. Well, they're able to purchase this land, but they still need buildings. So what they do is they send out a choir to sing, and initially they aren't enjoying much success. They're singing, you know, just normal, what we would consider American music. But then they start singing Negro spirituals. They begin singing slave songs. They introduce this music to the world. And they do it in such a way that it becomes very, very popular. And when you think of what they are doing, they are essentially raising up the same songs that their ancestors had raised up from the tobacco fields, from the cotton fields, from the corn fields. Songs that expressed hope, songs that express despair, songs that basically gave insight into the world that slaves lived in, where they are able to earn roughly around $150,000 as a result of an international tour that they engage in. So finally, they are able to build Jubilee Hall. And this building remains one of the most arresting pieces of architecture in the city. And it's symbolic in a lot of ways because the term Jubilee references the end of bondage. And the professor who trained me, my dissertation advisor actually is the guy who wrote the history of Fisk University, Joe Richardson. And he actually came to Fisk in 1966 to learn how to teach Black history. And here I am talking to y'all, so the world really runs in circles. Fisk was chartered as a university in 1867, August 22nd, 1867. Now this is an important site. Why? Because when we start thinking about education in Nashville, many of the public teachers that we have in the public school system that teach African American students come from Fisk University. Many of the professors at my beloved TSU during its first years were graduates of Fisk University. Many of the teachers at a school I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, Pearl High School, were Fisk University graduates. But there were other universities that deserve our attention as well. This is a photograph of Walden University. Walden, W-A-L-D-E-N. Walden began as a school for freedmen under the auspices of the Northern Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1865, they held classes for the first time at Andrew Chapel Methodist Episcopal Church. After the public schools opened in Nashville in 1867, It was recharted as Central Tennessee College. Then in 1876, Meharry Medical Department was added to the college. And this kind of references what I was alluding to earlier. All these things are connected in a very profound, very mighty way, if you will. In 1900, it was renamed Walden University. And its last location before it closed was where Trevecca University is currently located today. Next, we have Roger Williams University. Roger Williams University began holding classes in 1864. The classes were held in the home of a minister named Daniel Phillips. And the purpose of the school was initially to educate ministers. However, in 1866, the school was officially named the Nashville Normal Theological Institute. And what is interesting, and I did not know this until I moved to Nashville, that during its early days, this school was in direct competition with Fisk for the most bright and most talented black students. But after it granted its first bachelor's degree, this is roughly around 1874, 75, the school purchased a farm out on Hillsborough Road. Mysterious fires destroyed the school in January and in May of 1905. And ultimately, the school closed and the property was purchased by the George Peabody College for teachers. And this occurs in 1911. Now, I've always tried to interject some public history in our discussions, and I'll take the liberty to do this now. This building, this school sat at the site that is currently occupied by Confederate Memorial Hall. And I don't know, I've stopped following it, but maybe Professor Sharpstein can tell us if they changed the name on it yet. I know there was a big controversy over it. And one of the issues that oftentimes came up was that you were erasing history. But I wonder how many of those folks who made that claim, they had to be involved in a little bit of erasing themselves, because you never heard anything about Roger Williams in this conversation. But nevertheless, it is Roger Williams, of the four historically black colleges and universities that were in existence at the turn of the century, it was arguably one of the most important. And then you have Meharry Medical College. And I had this conversation or a debate, if you will. I don't know if it was a debate because I killed the person I was talking to, about which university produced, we were talking about the most outstanding or impactful graduates. And she argued Fisk, I argued Meharry, and then by the time I said my piece, I was like, wow, it ain't even close. I think it's Meharry. And if you disagree, we can have a conversation after this is over. Meharry was created it originated in 1876 as part of the medical division of Central Tennessee College. Its first president was a white man named George Whipple Hubbard. Now, it was established with the aid of the Freedmen's Aid Society. And you know, the school was motivated to train black doctors and caregivers. But these doctors and caregivers were given charge to treat everybody. And when we go through this, and be mindful of this, Meharry, when it first opened, it was located in the South Nashville. But right from the start, it produced some amazing people. One of the first was a woman. One of the first I want to talk about is a woman named Dr. Josey Wales, and I may have talked about her before, but I'm going to talk about her again, I think. She graduated during the early 1890s from Meharry, and immediately, excuse me. Yes, W-E-L-L-S, Josey Wales. She was quickly placed on the staff at Meharry. Then she got into administration. But while she's doing all of this, she opens up a general practice over near what is now 4th Avenue North and Martin Luther King Jr. And then she provided free health care for children at, you guys remember we discussed Nettie Napier last hour? At Nettie Napier's Day Home Club. She had helped to set policy at Meharry. And with her practice, she limited her practice primarily to diseases that affected women and children. Okay, this woman was something else, and y'all can kind of tell I like her a little bit. Okay, another very important person was Robert F. Boyd. He was born in Giles County, Tennessee. He comes to Nashville and he works as an apprentice, I guess you could say, under a physician named Dr. Paul Eve. And this is where his love of medicine begins. He enters Meharry in 1880 and graduates with honors 2 years later. Then in 1886, he earns a dental degree. And all the while he's doing this, he's the principal of a small school in rural Tennessee. This man was beloved in his community in that he used public forums to educate the community about the causes of diseases and prevention. One of the things that he really spoke out against, or he really tried to educate people on, was tuberculosis. But he did something else that I don't think we appreciate. Periodically, he would invite a prominent African-American surgeon named Daniel Hale Williams. He would say, "Come to Meharry." And Williams would come, and it would be to great fanfare. Why? Because if you read the newspaper prior to his arrival, Meharry gave the black population notice. It said, hey, if you are ailing and you need some type of surgery, you can come to Meharry and get this surgery at little or no cost. So this, as I said before, this man was beloved by his community. And when I remember reading an account of his funeral, and they ended up burying him out at Greenwood Cemetery, and you can go out there and see it today. But the funeral home was at on Charlotte. And according to the story, his coffin reached Greenwood Cemetery, and there were still people at the funeral home waiting to get started on the journey to Greenwood. So I'm not sure how many miles that is. That must have been a heck of a train. And then Charles V. Roman. In the pantheon of intelligent or intellectuals that have called Nashville home, I think Roman is he's in the top two, I think. And I don't think he's number two. Roman was an ear, nose, and throat doctor. He was also a dentist. He was also a historian. He owns the distinction of being the only guy that I've been able to find that's been on the staff of Fisk University, Meharry, and Tennessee State University at the same time. He was the editor of the Journal of the National Medical Association. He was also the vice president of the People's Savings and Trusts. By my count, he was the author of more than 40 works, but I'm sure there's some articles, some things out there that I missed. But having said that, Roman was, even though he's one of Nashville's, he's one of the elite, if you will. But he lived in North Nashville, right off of 14th Avenue North. He lived amongst the people he served. So we've been talking quite a bit about, well, initially we started with the discussion of primary education, talked a little bit about the colleges and universities that emerge, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this school, Pearl High School. Any Pearl High grads out there? Okay, 1, 2. Okay. Excuse me. I'm gonna tell you something about your Pearl grads. When I have asked people who went to Pearl to tell me about Pearl, immediately their backs stand up a little bit straighter, their chests puff out, then they tell me what I need to know about the school. And even when I take my students there, sometimes I'll get Mr. Melvin Black to show me around. Even when I take my students there, we are in awe of just everything. Pearl first opened its doors in 1883. It wasn't a high school at the time. It did not offer high school classes until the high school department at Meigs transferred to Pearl in 1898. If you were black and you lived in this city, you went to Pearl High School. Pearl High School has produced, and I got a photograph of it for you. Pearl High School has produced most of the outstanding African Americans of the 20th century. If they lived in Nashville, they went to Pearl. And it's a school, in my estimation, that is as important as any church that has been constructed in this city. The school itself was constructed by the architectural firm of McKissick and McKissick. Calvin and Moses McKissick set up an architectural firm in this city that would become the first black architectural firm in this nation. And they're still building stuff today. I was reading in the newspaper lately about, I think it was a major project that they were involved in New York. So they are still doing it. So when you go there, Pearl not only represents, I think, excellence in African American education, but the buildings, the hallways, everything about this school lives and breathes Nashville's Black history. They have a very nice museum there where you can go and you can see the graduates going all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. And it's a really moving experience to be there. Okay. Okay. My slide for American Baptist didn't make it in there, I appeal. And I won't talk a lot about it because I'm sure we'll hear a lot about it in our civil rights lecture. But bear this in mind, American Baptist was created to train ministers. And from the period of enslavement to today, arguably, these churches have been crucibles of Black leadership. That could be good and bad sometimes, but this is where they were cultivated. Black ministers were oftentimes the only people in the enslaved communities that had some sense of authority. And you understand why, right? Because they get their authority directly from on high. Now you got the school that's been created to establish Black ministers with the idea that they are to be concerned with the spiritual and physical well-beings of the people that they've been given charge over. So at ABC, when we look at that and we start considering these ministers that are associated with it, it kind of made sense that they would figure prominently in the civil rights movement. Now, I'll give you a couple of names. Kelly Miller Smith Sr., John Lewis was there. Bernard Lafayette was there. James Bevel was there. And one of the things that I try to emphasize to my students, these were young college age kids, right? And how old are you when you first hit the door at college? About 18 years old? And I tried to present these men as human beings, right? Just ordinary people. I can remember talking to a woman who knew John Lewis well. And I said, what did you think the first time you saw John Lewis? And she said this, she said, he was the most country guy I ever met in my life. He's from Alabama. And that made me feel pretty good because I was a country boy a long time before I became a professor. I'm not trying to say I'm a John Lewis or anything like that, but the country we have in common. That's about James Bevel. James Bevel said that, and I'm saying this kind of tongue-in-cheek, and I'm saying this as a Baptist. I don't mean any harm by this. Said that he came to ABC to be trained to be a minister so that he could learn to eat chicken and chase women. But the point I'm trying to make is the guy had joke. He was a jokey guy, and he reminds me of some of the friends that I grew up with. So I'll close by saying this, and this is essentially the same thing I said at the start. You can't define Nashville as the Athens of the South unless you take into account African Americans' desire to get an education. And this existed prior to the war. Although it is modified a little bit once the war begins because they push for the state, if you will, to provide for a free public education. This was an idea that emerged during Reconstruction. These students are being trained to read, write, learn arithmetic, but it's within these institutions that we see our notions of freedom, our notions of liberty being refined in a way that was unprecedented in American history. In that they get to the point to where they fervently believe that equality should mean the same thing for everybody. And when we start thinking about prominent black intellectuals, one of the most important that came up out of Nashville was W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois didn't have a real taste of Southern racism until he came to Fisk University. A professor whom I had the pleasure of meeting, I met him twice. I met him in Memphis and in Richmond right before he died. John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin, whose father represented African Americans that had been involved in the Tulsa riot of 1921. He came to Fisk, and this is where he honed his craft. And my professor, Joe Martin Richardson, white gentleman from some little small town in Missouri. He came to Fisk University in 1966 to learn to teach African American history. And I have had the honor to, I hope, teach you African American history over the last couple of days. So I'll pause now and take any questions that you might have. Okay, saw you first. Mm-hmm.
And the fellow from Persian Foster or Foster Persian, I can't remember, from Monroe, Louisiana, is said to have received medical education at Meharry here in Nashville.
It's because even to this day, and I know this stat because I know Meharry dentists, but they're still producing about 60% of all of the black dentists in America. The doctor that brought me into the world was a Meharry grad. He's a brilliant guy, but he was jokey. The last time I saw him, I was with my mother when we were in the store, and he reminded me that I was the first face, his was the first face that I saw when he came into the world. And then he said, and he promptly turned me around and spanked me on my backside. But that's true, their impact is still very much felt. Okay, so someone here, go ahead.
We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. Daniel Watkins, the person that was kind of behind Watkins Institute, because before it became an art school, when we were young, growing up here in Nashville, it was a place where people went to get their GED and do some other adult education type things. So we just wondered if he was behind that.
I really don't know. I'm not a Nashville native, so you probably no.
The answer is
No? All right, well, thank you for that. Let me get this gentleman, I got you. Okay. Some were, yes, because most of the Freedmen's Bureau agents were white. Freedmen's Bureau schools? Oh, yeah, a lot of them were, and it's tough because Southerners who got involved with Freedmen's Bureau schools, they were oftentimes described as scalawags. And that's another conversation, I think, but let me answer your question. Yes, the Bureau was instrumental in establishing schools, and oftentimes they had assistance, if you will, from whites. Particularly now, you bear in mind, you're a landowner, and the population that you have enslaved might be thinking about leaving. But I say, okay, I'm going to establish a school here for your children, and that would give them incentive to stay. And I said this kind of tongue-in-cheek the last time I spoke to y'all, but sometimes when I joke, I'm really serious. Education becomes almost another religious denomination for many African Americans, because the Freedmen's Bureau is doing what it can. It donates land, it donates property, it donates materials, and sometimes they bring in teachers as well to teach the freedmen. In some places they were welcome, but in other places not so much. The agent here in Nashville wrote, and this was 1866, early 1866, he writes to General Howard that he's opened up 50 schools in Middle Tennessee. In December, he writes that 50 schools have been burned in Middle Tennessee. And I don't know if those are the same schools, but at the end of the year, he ends up with the same number he had at the start of the year. The Bureau helped to establish colleges. You know, you got Fisk, and you got Talladega, and Tougaloo, and Howard, and Hampton, and Atlanta College. But the folks that were most impacted by Freedmen's Bureau schools were the primary and students that are just learning the rudiments of education. And this is another thing about Bureau schools, and the records are out there, and it's really fascinating stuff if y'all got time to check it out. This guy in Charleston, South Carolina, he's really excited because he has a school opened up. And he goes out for the first time and he looks and he has 200 students sitting in front of him. And the ages range from about 5 to, he said, 80. So that meant what, he had kids, he had mamas, grandmas, and I can imagine it being a drag for the younger folks, but still, it just speaks to how important education was. Well, I beat that question to death, I'm sorry. Yes?
Anything about Thomas Griswold West?
Tell me.
Well, I just know that his sisters were very active, that he was the, I think, son of Alice West, who was the sister of J. Frankie Pierce.
Okay.
So he was a physician, and I was wondering if there, I haven't been able to find out anything about him, and I was interested. And then the other person was Minnie E. Coleman, who was a woman, black physician, but she must, I mean, I don't know how many women black physicians there were back at the turn of the century.
I have a photograph of Josey Wales standing in front of her office, and there's some women standing with them, but I don't know who they were, whether they were doctors or whether they were nurses. I don't know. Okay, yes, sir.
We haven't talked a lot today about Tennessee State University, but I seem to have read that very shortly before TSU was founded, that there was a movement afoot by certain community organizers, the African American community perhaps, in Chattanooga for
We, and if Bobby Lovett has just written a book called, I forget the name of it, with a touch of greatness, the history of Tennessee State University. He lays it out in detail. But TSU had some very powerful advocates here in the city. Henry Allen Boyd, a guy named Benjamin Carr. Benjamin Carr fancied himself to be the sort of agricultural, he's a farmer politician, but he's really heavy on the politician side because he made things happen. Preston Taylor, the undertaker or a businessman, because he was involved in a lot of stuff in town as well. All that is to say, we had some heavy hitters here in Nashville that tipped the scales. Because as I stand here before you and think about it, you know, Hadley Park opens up at the same time as TSU, and all of the guys that were pushing for the park were also instrumental in TSU opening in 1912. And these gents, their political influence continues, because we bear in mind that TSU is being created during Jim Crow. And it's a hostile environment. And I'm trying to pull back because I'm about to get on a rant about land grant and inequalities and all that, but I'll spare you guys that today. But to answer your question, TSU Nashville had some heavy hitters here that were able to sway public opinion, and they got the governors and all, they're right here in town. Okay, so it's an excellent question. Yes, ma'am.
When you talked about Crystal Gregory, was that quote from a book that she wrote?
She wrote an article, and she needs to go ahead and publish it as a book. Crystal is brilliant, a dear friend. You know. And yeah, I'll kind of fudge it a little bit. I'll say a member of the audience say you need to go ahead and get that thing published, and she'll appreciate that.
So we can't access that?
I can if you give me your email address, I can send you the article because it was printed in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. Okay. Yes.
You asked for the Confederate Memorial Hall at Vanderbilt in 17. You asked them for names for the Memorial Hall, but Vanderbilt had to pay off the then daughter of the Confederacy to do that.
Oh, okay. Yes.
You haven't talked very much about whether or not there were any elected officials who were black, especially in the state legislature after the Civil War. And I know that there probably were for a while and then there weren't.
You have Joseph Lowry and Samuel Keeble, but bear in mind, and I have a list that I probably should send to you if you're interested in that. Bear in mind, Reconstruction more or less ended very quickly here in the volunteer state. By 1870, you got John Brown, out of Giles County being elected governor. And you have these laws on the books that have given blacks some rights, right? You got the 13th Amendment, abolish slavery, 14th Amendment, define citizenship, 15th Amendment, give blacks the right to vote. So when you start looking at politicians, particularly black politicians, and particularly in the context of Nashville, you got Keeble, and then you struggle to find some from this place. In Memphis, toward West Tennessee, you're doing all right because you got the majority of the black population in the state there. And they can elect black assemblymen. But here in Nashville, it's a little bit problematic. Okay, good question, thank you. Okay, I feel like I'm talking to y'all. Let me get some questions over here.
I wish I could remember, and I wish I had known about it ahead of time, but a few weeks ago, I spent all of Saturday watching a series. I'm not sure what channel it was on, but it was the history of black population in Tennessee.
Mhm.
They had Lovett and Dr. Busey for the two people that was extremely interesting.
I think,
One of the stories was fairly current, where the county that this early politician was black, and they wanted to put a memorial in that city, and they wouldn't take it. So that kind of thing is still.
is that something that was produced by Nashville Public Television? Yeah,
Yes, I believe so.
I'll try to find it.
Yeah, I didn't know about that.
Okay. I saw her first, and I'm gonna get you.
Could you say something about the role of Frankie Pierce, that was did also establish a location for the girls like this?
She, and it's interesting the role that when we look at Frankie Pierce, first and foremost, she was an advocate for young girls. She establishes that school. But we know her as a suffragist as well. And it puts her in an interesting spot because they're fighting for the rights for women to vote, but nevertheless, that right wouldn't be extended to her until much later on. It wouldn't be until really the Voting Rights Act of 1965 where blacks here can actively vote. But nevertheless, she was a part of the movement as well as Nettie Napier. And it's one of those conversations we often have where we try to figure out, why are they doing this? What do they have to prove? Because at the same time, right, you got black men that are going off to fight in World War I, but they're coming back and they're not receiving the same rights that they were fighting for. But and I remember asking you all if there were any statues of black women, and she's out there at Centennial Park amongst the suffragists. Okay, yes ma'am.
I'm familiar with the Rosenwald School in Williamson County. Do you know if there are any in Davidson County?
I don't know off the top of my head, but there.
About that very much as far as being in Nashville at all.
And a lot of the schools were established in rural areas. I know there are a heck of a lot of them in Meharry County. But I don't know about Nashville. Robert Clay, one of our most distinguished faculty, said they've established 500 Rosenwald schools in Tennessee. It is amazing. Okay, yes. Go ahead.
My husband and I, we moved here 40 years ago, and from the north, and the first question they asked of us, our friends and people that we knew, we had a son who was going to be Craig. What private school are you going to send your child to? Private schools in the north, there was just Catholic, and there was public. And I said, oh, we're public school people. I don't know anything about private schools. Do you have any information on the rise of so many of our private schools?
Let me check my watch. They began to flourish after May of 1954 with the Brown case. You see a proliferation of them during that time. And anytime there's a serious effort made to integrate public schools, they begin to pop up. Because you can't discriminate based upon race, but you can discriminate based upon disadvantages created by prior discrimination. That makes sense? Okay. So, yeah, and it's the same everywhere. All my kids are educated in public school, but I've looked at private schools, and I'll go and I'll pull up to a place and I'll see like a year 1955, 1956, and I already kind of know how things are going to be. Or either early 70s in Tallahassee. Yes?
Is Pearl now head middle magnet?
No, it's MLK.
Okay, my granddaughter goes there, and I am utterly delighted to see so integrated a school.
It is
Black,
something.
white, Asian, Middle Eastern, and when the kids come out, they're happy and peaceful. I'm from the north, and the high school in Morristown, New Jersey has race fights. Not here, not in Hillsborough High School. It's a real delight to see the South could teach the North some lessons.
Still does exist in Pearl College.
Yeah, Pearl College, yeah. Yes.
Two things, last month I was up at Nashville Cemetery for the first time, and I was totally surprised that, the age of one of the Fisk University singers who was buried out there, and she was one of the first ones, was 13. When she came to Fisk and was one of the first Jubilee singers. So I was just shocked because in my mind, I'm in the 20th and 21st century where you're probably 18 or more before you go to college. And I don't know if that was common or not. And the other thing I wanted to mention is if you ever had a tour with Melvin Black, the history, that's one of the precious things of the effort to really contain that history, keep it alive. But I was also shocked when we gave me the tour and to see that, I guess this was even in the 1900s, more females graduated from high school than males. Because I did not expect that even most of the females were going to high school. So could you make some comments about those people?
It's, well, first, the age of the Fisk grad, the Fisk grad. Shout out to my university, Hattie Hale, the president's wife, William Jasper Hale, first president of TSU, married a woman who graduated from Fisk at 16, so. Yeah, 16, Hattie Hale, she grew up on Gay Street here in Nashville. Okay, what was your second questions? What do you want me to speak on?
About when women were going to high school and staying themselves there because I guess the young men needed to go and work.
I haven't studied Nashville enough to give you a reason why, but I've studied country folks, and I can tell you that men were expected to work. 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, that was it, and that continued until largely 1960s. In rural areas, we oftentimes had, I don't know if you guys have them here, y'all know what strawberry schools are? Okay. Schools that shut down when it's time to pick strawberries. Okay. And those, I don't know if that explains what we're witnessing here in town, but if I was a gambling man, I'd be willing to bet that, at least during the early days, the expectation was for the guys to work. And then there's a mindset too that, you know, if blacks are going to be farmers, then they really don't need that much of an education. That makes sense? I mean, it doesn't make sense, but yeah, okay, all right. Well, is that it, I guess? Yes, where?
Oh, I was just going to ask, the mention of private schools leads me to ask about the magnet schools that are used by the metro school system. Debbie, any thoughts about the wisdom of the magnet schools? Are they a good thing for the black students in general, for students in general in the metro school?
I try to deal more so with past policy than public policy. But if my kid was interested in going to one of these magnets, like, and I work sometimes, well, in the past I've worked with John Early, the museum magnet. Have y'all been out there? Or Robert M. Churchwell, the museum. Y'all need to check that place out. But I wouldn't have any problem with them. I really, that's a little bit outside of my lane, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.